Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. And I'm going to echo a lot of what Steve said about opening the discourse. I'm going to bring, I'm the only reporter here on the panel. That's one of the hats I'm going to have. So I'm going to first tell you something about my observations of the occupation and why I believe the two-state solution is dead. I'm going to move on to a little bit of analysis about why this came to pass, why this historic compromise is over. And the third part is I'm going to be put on my movement hat a little bit. Steve understands the degree, mentioned the degree of activism that this is going to require on all our parts, and I have my own thoughts about where we go from here and how we do that as Americans. And there's also a Jewish American piece that I want to bring in because I think that's so important. First, as a reporter, I want to tell you that it's great to be in Rayburn describing the occupation. This is work that our politicians should be doing all the time. Our members of the executive branch should be going to the Hill and describing the occupation. Congressmen should be standing up, congresswomen should be standing up and describing the occupation. They're not. And that has made my job very important. You know, personally, I'm somewhat grateful for that, but it represents a great deficit in our national conversation, that I'm the one who has to bring that news, that reporters have to, on the margins, reporters have to bring that news. So one scene from the occupation, you walk out, you go out in East Jerusalem to Abu Dis, which is the village that was going to be the capital of the Palestinian state under Camp David, Oslo negotiations. It's 2 miles east of the old city, just as the Knesset is 2 miles west. And so this is where the Palestinians would have their parliament building. And I believe there are some parliament buildings there. But if you go out from East Jerusalem, from the old city, through the Mount of Olives, past the Dome of the Rock, this incredible World Heritage site, you come to a 26-foot tall concrete wall. And that is the Palestinian capital. This concrete wall separation fence that keeps people from the West Bank from coming into occupied East Jerusalem. So there before your eyes is one of the symbols of apartheid in in Jerusalem. And there's concertina wire along the top of this wall so that kids can't scale it. Kids have been able to figure out a way to sort of belay themselves up between the slabs using rope and to get into East Jerusalem, but now they've put up this barbed wire. Second scene is a small village in near the Hebron Hills in Area C in the West Bank, which I visited. And there are Palestinian herdsmen there who have a couple of small houses and sheds for livestock. And the day I visited this town, I'm not going to get, Sadat al-Taleh, I think it was called, a very small hamlet. The Israelis had come in a few days before and using a bulldozer had destroyed the cistern. So this kind of ancient practice that's throughout the Middle East and many parts of the world of storing water in cisterns, in this case a limestone cistern carved out of the hill, the Israelis had destroyed that. And so the source of water was destroyed, and there were 5 sheep killed. And this kind of wanton destruction is going on a regular basis in the West Bank with the aim of pushing people off the land, off Area C, and into cities where they can be sort of gathered. Israel has always wanted as much land as possible with as few Palestinians on it. That has been part of the program from the start. A third scene from the occupation. I go out of my hotel, the research institute I stay in East Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, and I'm right next to the Quartet offices, this huge, magnificent structure built for Tony Blair, with big security walls around it. And just up on the other side, that's on one side of me, and on the other side is the Shepherd Hotel, Palestinian palace, traditionally. This is a very fancy section, traditionally, of Jerusalem, the Sheikh Jarrah area. And now it's been, the palace is being, parts of it have been bulldozed. It's owned by a doctor from Florida, Irving Moskowitz, has developed a settlement there. And they're putting up, so they're moving Palestinians out of Sheikh Jarrah and bringing in more settlers. And that evidence, when you're in Jerusalem, is everywhere around you. You see Israeli flags hanging in Palestinian neighborhoods as symbols of defiance. We're taking over. And that was most poignant to me when I was there at Ramadan, and I was in the old city and saw the people, people who had gone to the Haram al-Sharif for prayers on Friday, jamming those streets and coming out of the old city. And over them are at one point, five Israeli flags hanging down with the Star of David, saying, "We are taking over the Arab Quarter too," and moving settlers in. It's for this reason that because the Israel has so permeated the West Bank and East Jerusalem and has encircled East Jerusalem, it's for this reason that I believe the two-state solution is over. It's not going to happen. There are 600,000, 650,000 Israelis east of the Green Line. They're not going to move. And so what you find is a situation in which this historic conflict, which has been called, two irreconcilable claims to the same land, is over. There's no, one side has won. It's always been the case that one side was winning. We're now at a point where it's just one side controls all the land, with the exception of the Area A, in which the PA is exercising some type of authority. And I think that when you look at, I'm going to steal one of Henry's lines here, but one thing that really stands out when you look at the history of this conflict is that one side has compromised. There has been only one compromise in this whole struggle, and that was in the late 80s when the PLO said, we will accept a state on 22% of this historic territory. And Henry has made that point. And that compromise, whether it was going to last, maybe a two-state solution would have worked, I can't say. There are justice issues around it that have caused some to question whether it would be sustainable, but that historic compromise has been destroyed over the last 20 years. So this historic effort is reached to compromise on these two sides, and that compromise is now destroyed. And I think that the question arises of why this happened, and I think that from the Israeli standpoint, I'm reading Rashid Khalidi's book right now, Brokers of Deceit, which is about the American role in failing to balance the two sides in any manner. Khalidi points out that as early as in the 1977 Likud platform, the program was extremely clear about we want all the land of Israel. We are not going to bring the settlers back. We may allow, in '82, there was a CIA analyst created a document for the Reagan administration saying the Israelis will allow some type of governing authority ultimately in portions of the West Bank, but they're going to control this territory, they're going to have access to water, and they're not going to pull back the settlers. So Khalidi's point is that this policy on the part of Israel, expansionist, unapologetic claim to all this land, that this policy was very clear, has been clear from the start, from the beginning where the Jewish state was given 55% of the territory, and 2 years later after conflict wound up with 78%, to now where this governing authority on the West Bank that Netanyahu seems to imagine, if he imagines anything, a Palestinian entity there, is a, as my publisher Scott Roth likes to say, a castrated rump state. That's what it would produce. It's not this viable word that is thrown around. Viable, yes, if you pump international aid into it and help these people along. No one wants to be helped along, but that's what it would require to maintain a Palestinian state as they envision it. So the question is, why did the United States allow this to happen? And there I defer to Steve. I share his view that the Israel lobby has been determinative on this question. Again, Scott, my publisher, was in at Ben Gurion last month for Obama's arrival. And he was on the tarmac, on this red carpet. There, all the dignitaries were waiting. The Air Force One comes down, and who comes out but Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Elliot Engel? They got rides to Israel with the president. It's a little like the president trying to organize for, trying to build a movement for limiting gun rights, and bringing in Max Baucus, as a representative Democrat. You can't build a coalition when the people, the powers that you are recruiting inside the Congress and in our political life are undermining your position. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz has undermined it by referring to the settlements that surround Jerusalem as suburbs. They're so-called settlements. And she led the move at last year's Democratic Convention to push through this platform declaring Jerusalem to be Israel's capital. So partition always said that Jerusalem would be internationalized. Now our political structure is firmly behind the Judaization of Jerusalem. And that's the person that he brings on his plane with him. I think that this has to do with the power of the lobby in our political life. And moving on to the movement piece, the lobby draws its strength from the fact that the American Jewish community committed itself to Zionism and the need for a Jewish state in the last 60 years, or it began 100 years ago. And so finally to this movement piece, I think that as a journalist and as someone who is trying to foster open debate, I think that we are facing a period in which this old paradigm has collapsed and we have to move forward. And some of my work is going to be in a kind of recovery movement, both inside American Jewish life and inside American life, political life. In the Jewish piece of it is that I am a Jew who is an anti-Zionist. I don't see a need for a Jewish state. I've never seen a need for a Jewish state. Now, the reasons that my community embraced Zionism, there were very real reasons for that, of course. And I may well have been a Zionist 100 years ago, even 80 years ago. And surely maybe right after World War II, I might have been a Zionist. Zionism was a real, a valid response and a predictable response to the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe as Jews entered the cities of Central and Eastern Europe. And it was there was always an anti-Zionist strain in Jewish life, but that ended pretty much after World War II and then after the '67 war. And what I'm doing in my work inside Jewish life is to say that I like a state in which a religious minority has freedoms and rights, as I do in the United States. That's the type of state that I want. I don't believe in, I've never seen a need for a Jewish state, and I think that creating a Jewish state has resulted, what I describe about the occupation has resulted inevitably from the character of that state, that it is the Jewish national home, that some of the oppression of minorities and the contempt for Palestinians grows out of the very nature of that creation. So I'm taking on Zionists in American Jewish life. I want to have that conversation. That's very important, to go into this and say, why are you here enjoying the freedoms of liberal democracy if you think it's so important to have a Jewish state? And is it possible to have sort of warehouse one state while you're in another? There are contradictions that I think are deep inside Zionism that have to be interrogated, and I am taking that project on, and a lot of my friends in the Jewish life are taking that on. The American piece of that is that there was an anti-Zionist element in American political life, too. Now, the overlap of anti-Zionism in American political life and anti-Semitism was, unfortunately, there was a certain congruence of those communities. But that being said, we're not far from where George Marshall, the Secretary of State, said to Truman in '48, if you recognize this state, I'm not going to vote for you in the next election. We're not far from where James Forrestal died after committed suicide after opposing the creation of a Jewish state and feeling that he was hounded by Zionists. In fact, the press helped to destroy his reputation for that. And we're not far from the State Department, where Near East Affairs, the Arabists, said back in '48, if you create a Jewish state in Palestine, there is going to be never-ending conflict. And surely there has been never-ending conflict. So I think that there has to be a recovery of our own American tradition of questioning an ethnocracy. The last point I'd make is that I'm optimistic about this change, about our ability to make this change, not because of the politicians. I think that's a dead letter right now, witness Obama's flying companions. But I think that the media are changing. And I would point to the New York Times Magazine piece of a few weeks back that showed Palestinian resistance in the little village of Nabi Saleh, the occupied village of Nabi Saleh. This is a village where they can't even get to their spring, their source of water, because there's a settlement built on the hillside right across from them. And these people have gone out and every week to demonstrate, and the kids throw stones at the soldiers. And the triumph of this piece, in my view, was that we saw Palestinian resistance honored on the front page of the New York Times Magazine, the faces of Palestinians who are resisting occupation. And what's more, the piece honored a principle, which is that you have a right to resist occupation. Every time that Palestinians have resisted occupation over the last 60 years, or routinely, this is described as terrorism, or they're crazies. Our discourse on this has been bankrupt. And what this article shows is that finally we are beginning in this country to recognize that there are real sources for this rage, and that are actually human rights. And so that human rights discourse is, I think, the last piece of this that is really going to become more and more a refrain as the margins of journalism, but also sometimes the New York Times begins to reflect some of these views. Thank you.